Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight for this conversation between Whess Harman and Cole Pauls. Cole's pop comic, as you might have seen, opens these current issue themed gossip. I'm Joy. I'm the current editor at CMag. We're joined by Mondek, who's online reviews editor. She's running tech behind the scenes today. Please note that we are recording the session and this will be made available online after the talk. And also, if you want to share it for people who couldn't make it or other people who would be interested. Just to begin, myself and C's offices are located in Toronto or Tuckaronto, the ancestral land of many peoples, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the Credit. This is to keep in mind the ongoing colonial project of Canada. So we continue to say this to defer to the land and to the histories and presence of Indigenous peoples. And we express this relation as largely uninvited guests, and also an effort to spur viewers your groundedness in embodying your relations to wherever you are out there. So I'm really excited that Whess and Cole have made time to be here today. And as I said, they're going to talk about the artist project they brought to sea. In our magazines, we have artist projects in every issue that span several pages in the beginning. And at the end, we invite a curator who then chooses an artist to collaborate with. So today's conversation runs for about an hour, including about a 10-minute Q&A at the end, which you can input questions into using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, I encourage you to get comfortable, casual, grab a drink if you're in a place to, and get comfortable for tonight. So I'm excited again to introduce Whess and Cole. Just to say, Cole's also recently recognized as a finalist for the Yukon Prize for Visual Arts. I feel like this project feels special for also how often Cole has worked in the print format, which hasn't been usual for the artists in these pages in comics, and for the humor that exists in Cole's works. Alongside, in their text, Whess writes about the good and bad kinds of gossip in small Indigenous communities, how that way of passed along oral stories can be a way to trace family bearings, let off steam, as they say in this very fleshy way, talking about the gelatinous slime of colonial trauma, but also that kind of gossip and sharing of knowledge is a way to express love and protection within communities. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this work, and without delay, I'll hand this conversation over to them.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories in so-called Vancouver. My name is Whess Harman. I am also an artist, but I'm here more in a curatorial capacity today. My very glamorous day job, and I mean that seriously, is as the curator at Grant Gallery, which I love. Is there any introductions you'd like to add, Cole?
Hi everybody. I'm in the Yukon right now. I'm in my parents' RV in Haines Junction. And yeah, very happy to be here. Very happy to hang out with Whess for an hour and talk gossip. Hot gossip.
Hot gossip, the hottest gossip. Yeah, it feels like we started this a long time ago. I guess this was like the spring issue came out in April. That sounds kind of right. And yeah, I was so nervous to like say yes to this project. Like, gossip is a really tricky topic to navigate. Yeah, so yeah, when I first approached you about this, I was so glad that you had pitched like this pretty like lighthearted, warm kind of story. because there's just been so much gossip happening, particularly around like the Pretendian issue, and I don't know, I was dreading finding ourselves talking about that or something.
Yeah, or like talking about like, oh, did you hear about this professor who's a shithead or something? Like
Yeah,
I always
like,
had that assumption about them, but it was true. No. Yeah, it's like there's a place for that, but I definitely when you offered me this opportunity, um I thought about family gossip. I thought about how that sort of gossip can either spread joy or frustration. Um but as valuable as it is to like, call someone out and take them down a peg and maybe take their power away when they're abusing it. Um, the gossip that I find really valuable is what's happening with my cousins and my uncles and my aunties. Um, so when the idea was gossip, I was like, oh man, what do I do? How do I like approach this? So I thought about the different types of gossip in my what's going on in my life, and it's like relationship gossip, it's family gossip, it's just dirty gossip maybe. But I thought about the types of gossip going on and I was like, well, what would I want to talk about? Um and have it kind of like a part of my world. So I thought about what about if I talk about my uncle who's dating my cousin? Because at the time it was the big hot gossip in my family. And Wes, this, that Indigenous families are really big. And even when someone is like your fourth or fifth cousin, you still call them your cousin. Even when they're maybe not even related to you, which is this is the case, is that my cousin is dating my uncle, which is the reality of it. But she, we're not blood related, but she's always been my cousin. So it's hot gossip because she's been my cousin my whole life. And now she's dating my uncle, you know?
fancy
Um,
cousin.
yeah, exactly. And then, I thought about that a lot. And, if you've read the comic, that's kind of like the punchline at the end of it is that like my cousin just wants to be a cousin. She does not want to be called auntie. Um, and I just saw her this week and the whole time I just said, "Hi, cousin Lori." Did not call her auntie. She told me I'm still not ready for that. Even though my uncle and my cousin now are on they're saying the L word now.
Cool.
So things are getting serious. They're more serious than they were when I drew the comic. Um and trying to think. I think like honestly, I found the comic to be pretty difficult to draw because I was trying to find a balance of how to keep it funny but also kind of keep it um lighthearted and not just like family shit talking about each other behind each other's backs. Um, and the other thing was actually my cousin uh passed away during it when I was drawing it, and my cousin Dakota is my uncle Grant's eldest son.
Mhm.
So it was like I was making a comic about his father, and then his son died, and that was really tough, to kind of like try and make this lighthearted comic while this heaviness was happening around in my family. Um, but it kind of unified us too, though, because I was able to show the comic to my family, and they were able to look at it with like hungry eyes because they were such in grief. So they were like ready for a laugh. And when I got to show them the comic, they thought it was so funny. Um, Oh yeah, I should mention too, I drew the whole comic. It got published. I did not tell my cousin or my uncle it was published. It
I
just
was
was
gonna
out in
ask
the world.
that.
I just let it go out. And then the magazine came in the mail and I showed my parents and they were like, "What did you do?" But they thought it was really funny. And then I got to show my cousin and my uncle. I got to go, "Hey, check this out." And when they read it, they were like, "Oh, this is about us." Like they thought it was really funny. Um, like my cousin thought it was hilarious, and my mom sent me a video of her reading the comic out loud, and she's like hysterical. Like she's like on the floor rolling, hysterically laughing. Um, and now my family's like, now I gotta like keep my mouth shut because it might end up in one of your comics now, and we won't find out till it's on newsstands for all of the nation to read before I do.
Yeah,
Which is
that
not usually my MO. Usually I work with people, I get their permission, all that sort of stuff. Um, but I knew my uncle could take it. I knew my cousin could take it. I also changed them so they don't really look like who they are. I
mhm.
guess if you know me, I said their names, so I kind of outed them. But they're very happy in the relationship now, so I think it's okay to out them at this point.
Yeah, it's yeah, that was one of my questions. Do you ever find yourself like holding back and like kind of self-editing when you're putting together stories about family? Because a lot of your work has been about family in some way or another. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I get very nervous sometimes, even though I'm not often directly representing family members, but like
Mhm.
I've been making a lot of button blankets and I have such an anxiety about one day, like an auntie calling me out and just being like, you did it wrong, or you shouldn't have done that, or something like that.
Yeah.
Does that ever factor in for you when you're working?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely expect or hope that there's someone who's gonna like correct me when I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess like at this point, I try and work with reference. I try and work with people directly. So those like anxieties don't really cross my mind unless I don't have those resources.
Mhm.
Um, so like, if someone's passed and I can't ask them the question, maybe I'll have anxiety over not getting it right just because I can't find the real answer. Um, but for the most part, it's like I'm working with community members, I'm working with family members directly. So before I get to drawing, if there's a mistake, it's usually corrected, right? Because it's like I'll tell them the gist of it by writing it or telling them orally. Um, and I like to show them my pencils and stuff too before I ink so I can correct anything without having to like make any really big changes or it be like a really big struggle to correct myself.
Yeah.
Um, but when I just saw my family this weekend for my grandma's funeral, I told everybody, I was like, if you see me mess up, like point it out, like please, like tell me when I am wrong and I'll correct myself because a big part of why I make my comics is because I'm trying to make a cultural correct representation of Yukon First Nations, of Teltan people. And if I'm not doing it right, like please tell me because I can take it. I can take the criticism and I want to change it because it's, to be corrected by someone like an elder, it's like an honor. If someone feels comfortable enough to tell you those two colors can't touch or that's wrong because of X, Y, and Z, then I'll take it to the chin and say thanks.
Yeah, I think that's something kind of interesting in being in an issue about gossip when we both come from cultures where the ownership of stories is so important. Um, and it's definitely for me an added layer whenever I have to talk about family or, well, maybe not family, but like indigeneity in general. And um, I also know like for me, one of the difficult things about gossip in general for me, particularly the type of gossip that I think is really meant to be about community safety, is like, what stories are yours to tell? We've had conversations like this where we're just like, I can't tell you the name, but I know this thing and I think you should know too. And like, yeah, it's just who has the right to tell the stories is always a really tricky spot to navigate.
Yeah, no, there's for instance, and when I was making Dakota Warriors, I wanted to include a Dakota dancers song. So that's the traditional song and dance group from my hometown, which I named my book after. And when I asked my community, can I include this song in my book? They said no. They said no right away. And I was like, okay, I'll respect that, but can you tell me why now? And they told me because that song is a song that is supposed to be sung and performed. And that is the purpose of that song. It is not supposed to be written and shown like as a drawing. That's not the purpose of it. It has to be performed and sung, and they're supposed to be dancing to it. And if none of those things are together, then it's not the way it should be done. And so in that case, it's like I can't make my character dance and sing unless it was like an animation. So I'm just not going to include it because I asked for permission about this song and to include something, and I was told no, and I was told the reason why, and I'll just respect it, and now I know, like that's the standard, at least for that song.
Yeah. Well, that's also a way of like passing down that knowledge too, is like, you now know why. And in the future, I'm sure you'll come up with a situation where someone will be asking you, is it okay if I do this? And yeah, it's one of those things. It's like, I think a lot of people have talked about this before, but like when you go home, particularly like when you go home with the ambition to like have cultural teachings, it's so much about just paying attention and like being engaged enough to ask the right questions, because a lot of the information doesn't just come out easily.
Mhm.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, there's a lot of protocol in my culture, and I'm sure in yours too, because we're neighbor nations,
yeah,
and I learned a lot of new protocol during my grandmother's funeral just because I'd never been to a Teltan funeral. So, there's stuff like that where, there's a rhyme and reason somewhere else, but someone else does it differently and they have their own reason for it, and you just respect it. They're both right. And you just try and do it in a way that's respectful and in a way that like honors your culture.
yeah, which is I mean, so much of like, I would say, especially when we were in school, like so much of the question that we were dealing with from a lot of people was about appropriation. And it's interesting for, I think, us coming from a culture where appropriation is already an embedded conversation, because you can't appropriate another clan's song or another clan's
Mhm.
regalia. And I find personally, it's really easy to let go of things when people tell me not to do it a certain way.
Right.
But I don't know. Whenever I've tried to tell people not to do things a certain way, the ego gets chafed, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, there's something like, I don't know, when I work with other Indigenous people, like that's what I really like about working with them, is because there's not really that barrier of like having to over explain things. Um, like with you, it's like I feel like that. It's like I don't have to over explain things. I'm just like, here's the protocol, and that's it. And you understand that that's the rule. That's how things are operated. Um, and like working with like non-Indigenous people, they might not be totally aware of that. Like, I know this is maybe not a great example, but like I did a workshop in like a couple weeks ago, and they gifted me a bucket hat, and the bucket hat had eagles on it. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, great. This is my sub clan. I can still wear this. And they were like, oh, I didn't even think of that. Like they were a non-Indigenous person gifting a Native person a Native object, but they didn't even consider like if I could wear that animal, you
Mhm.
know. But for me it worked out because like I'm wolf, so my sub clans are orca and eagle. So like I can wear it and I can proudly wear it. Um, but when I told them that, they were like, "Oh, I never even thought of that before." And I was like, "Yeah, well, it's something that I always think of because it's just it's second nature to me."
Yeah. And I don't know if I can measure this in any particular way, but I do think like with your work, that is something that is really a strength in it. Um, just that ability to question things and like let go of things without having a bruised ego about it. And yeah. Um, should we show people the comic? I assume most people have seen it, but
Yeah, sure. I
yeah,
mean, for for why not? Just for the sake of it.
yeah, enjoy a picture, everyone.
Okay.
Several pictures.
Um, I could do a reading. I've done it quite a bit actually during my grandmother's funeral because
Yeah,
one, it's about my family, and two, my grandparents are in it at one point, so I could I've done this a couple times.
I'm ready.
So excuse me. Chäshu Kadini, which means say that again in Southern Shoshone. And I was trying to figure out a good word for gossip, and I couldn't really find anything super substantial. And then I found say that again, like repeat yourself. And I thought, that's pretty close to gossip. You're repeating what you heard, and you're being, devious about it, or you're self-righteous about it. So say that again. Guess who I saw together? Who? Your Agalan and your Ayata, which is your relations, which is the closest thing to cousin, and then Ayata, which is your father's brother. So it's like a Southern Shoshone thing where you can't just say uncle, you have to say how you're related to that person. Oh, really? Yeah, and I saw them holding hands at the KFC parking lot. Oh, yeah. That's because he came up for my Andua Johnny's headstone Nakwata, which means mother's brother, same clan, and potlatch. They're opposite clans. It could work. And then, the two cousins are looking at each other like, I don't know about that. At the Nakwata, the MC performed the song The Injal Crawl, where all the single men dance and then all the single women dance after. He caught her attention dancing. I guess the song worked. Hee hee hee. So you can see here, I'll just zoom in. That's my grandma and my grandpa. Oh, right there. So yeah, my grandma just passed. But I got to show her this comic the last time I got to see her. Here, let me skip to the next page. That was a couple weeks ago. So you knew? Yeah. And I also know she went down and visited him already. What? I guess that means they're getting serious. He took her to the bead store and he let her pick anything she wanted. This store has all the colors I was looking for. I have a lot of sewing to do for a nakwara. She cooked him bannock just the way he likes it. Here's your umbat katalat sugenchu, which is burnt food bannock. And the jam was handpicked by me in my traditional homelands. Wow. Yeah, but when I talked to my other Agalan who visited them, my Ayata said, so I have to keep moving on your preview where you guys are. Hey, Umbra, You can call her Ambe now. She leaned in and said, maybe just stick with Agalan. Ah ha 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 ha. Add law, which is laughter in Southern Shoshone. Yeah, so that's the comic. I don't think I have any other Easter eggs to show you besides talking. But yeah, so I got to show this comic to like my whole family after my grandma's funeral. And my uncle was there and my cousin was there, and I read it in front of everybody and my whole family, and it was like I was like the funniest comedian of the night. They loved it. I think my family really needed it because, it was my grandmother's funeral and we had just finished, putting her in the ground. So it was good. It was good medicine, to poke fun at my uncle and to say your nephew made fun of you in a public magazine that anyone can buy now. Because my uncle's he's he's a wise ass sometimes, I'll be honest, but he's a good uncle, and I know he can take it. So I'm kind of being extra sassy because he's extra sassy sometimes. So
I love I have sassy uncles and I don't get to see them very often, but I think the last time I saw them I just matured a lot and was like a lot more confident with myself and was
Right.
able to dish back to them.
Yeah.
And the level of respect I got from that was so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like teasing's a big part of our culture. Uh I try I try to be mindful of like who can handle teasing and who can't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a lot of that. I mean, uh it's a funeral and my grandma, she's the matriarch, so is high emotion, but there was lots of teasing during my grandmother's service and after it and before it and all that stuff when we had our family gatherings and meetings about everything. Lots of teasing, lots of giggles, a lot of frustration, but also a lot of love at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, it's always the old thing of like humor really does a lot of heavy lifting in getting us through things, and especially around grief.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry. Pause for grief. We've both had kind of a shitty year on that front. But yeah, there's so many of the projects I work on with you, and I feel like we're playing this like back and forth game of tag. It's just, I really admire that like you always manage to pull out something like positive and bright and like something that feels really insightful into our cultures without having to focus on what we're usually asked to do. And like we've talked about this before and I mentioned it in the article I wrote for the magazine, but just working as an illustrator, as an Indigenous illustrator right now often means having to sit with topics like residential school or reconciliation in such a broad way that it's like, how could I possibly contain this in a page? And I will say, speaking for myself, it is like not easy to pick the positive side of things. But you have always been one of the people that really inspired me to do so.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we just entered the flattery section. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely could write about a lot of negativity and a lot of grief and stuff, but I don't really feel the need to because it's just like it's a part of life, but it's not the stories I want to tell. Like I I I was a guest at TCAF this year, and I did a bunch of panels, and one of the panels I had, I got these really weird questions where people were like, your comics are so fun and silly and they're like really creative, but you're native and Native people are full of trauma, like residential school. So how come we don't talk about that stuff? And I was like, I looked at the person like, how is that a question you came up with? And
Yeah.
so let me answer this for you now. One, residential schools, all that sort of stuff. When you learn about that, you're learning about Christianity. You're not learning about First Nations history and culture. Like that wasn't a part of us. That was a part of you. Um, and the torture and all the horrible things that we experience, that is on you. It is not a part of us. And two, that's tough enough for my family to talk about. So what makes you think that I'm going to open up and talk about it publicly? You
Mhm.
know, like what gives you the audacity to think I can ask you about residential school just because you have brown eyes and I know that you're native, and because I see that you're like, a person of color, I need to ask you about your trauma. And it's like, no, there's a time and place for that. If I'm going to talk about trauma, it's going to be on my own terms. It's going to be on my own family's terms. It's not going to be performative for some non-native person who just wants to pat on their back to say, I listened to a residential school survivor. Like, no, I'm
Yeah.
not doing that for you. So
I
my
think it's,
comics are going to be about what I want.
yeah. And I think it's also worth saying, like, I don't know. I think I'm always caught between like balancing the responsibility of holding those stories in a way that is gentle, up against like being gentle with yourself. Um, like I've been working on an accessibility writer, mostly because I'm not primarily an illustrator. Like I have a lot of other gigs and a lot of other interests. But yeah, I'm at the point where I'm actually like, I am not going to make comics about any of these topics anymore because I've sat with them for too long. It's really difficult. It's really traumatizing. I don't have extra insight on why this happened, especially. I only
Mhm.
know what it's done to my community.
Yeah.
And I'm way more interested in like, because I think we understand enough of why it happened. I'm way more interested in like building up stories that introduce new ideas, because like I don't know, it's tough. Like I never want to brush aside those topics, but
Mhm.
they've become so difficult and so suffocating, and so one note. Like I don't see a lot of new things being added in, uh, because we're past the point of conversation on a lot of those topics. It's like we need action. We need to have the supports in our communities to heal from this. Um, yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, no, it is, and it's like one of those things too where people expect it out of us. Universities want it. They dangle, $300 in front of your face for you to bleed out in front of the stage, in front of everyone, and it's not the fun thing to do all the time.
Well, it's
And
also hard,
yeah, it's
like,
exhausting.
and we've had so many people in our communities, especially in artist communities, who have already spent so much time doing that. Like if you look at 90s Indigenous performance art, um, to me, that's the moment where people really started yelling and really started, where showing your trauma and how you were processing it was deeply effective. Um, but yeah, from the curatorial side of things, like, especially working in a gallery that is so focused on identity-based work,
Hmm.
it's weird to start to develop like a sense of like, okay, but I need more than just the trauma. And it's hard to tell people that when they're literally working through their trauma in their work.
Yeah, it's like as an artist, I really respect and have an open ear for when people tell, their lived experiences and their personal stories. Um, but there's kind of like a time and place for that, and that you have to be like mentally ready for it too at the same time. I kind of go back to like honestly, like one of my favorite performances by an Indigenous artist is Lawrence Polyexpilepton's shooting of the Indian Act. You know, like it's such a good definition of like, oh, you know, and like the cultural aspect of harvesting as an Indigenous person, but also being so angry about something that you'd want to shoot it. So you're like literally just shooting a piece of paper, you know?
Yeah.
So like, you know, when Lawrence has done that, he's leaving us to do anything else, you know, like I
Yeah.
don't need to do that again because Lawrence did it for us and we can continue our work somewhere else.
Yeah. Which maybe trying to think of how to ask a question. Well, yeah, maybe what's pizza punks for you in contrast? Because I love pizza punks, but it's I think you've yourself said like it's not an Indigenous comic about indigeneity. It's a comic by an Indigenous person.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, it's like people can seek out um like an answer in your work and then they kind of just fill in the blank for you. And I've had a lot of people talk about pizza punks as like an indigenous story and about how it's like about urban indigeneity and all these things. And I would disagree because like just because I'm indigenous and the comic has indigenous characters in it and some of them happen to do indigenous things in it doesn't mean it's an indigenous comic, you know. It just means that there's indigenous characters in that world, you
Mhm.
know. And to some universities that's the bare minimum. They think that that's good enough. If it's written by a native person and has native people in it, it's good enough. um and that's, you know, my definition is not that. It's like maybe if the author told the public in some interview and was like, "Yeah, I do consider this work an indigenous comic for X, Y, and Z." You know, I would listen to it. Um, but it's just funny because I've been vocal about it, being like, "I disagree with your thought because I don't think it is an indigenous comic." And then people are still posting about how it's a comic about urban indigeneity, and I'm just like, you're really stretching the comic out into something, you know, to fit whatever agenda you want, which is I guess that's hopeful thinking, I suppose, but I'm literally disagreeing with you now as the author who drew the whole thing. So maybe maybe reconsider your position on the book.
Well, I think that's also when you tell someone that ideally should be an invitation to be like, well, what other reads are there in here that you can extrapolate from this? And because yeah, Pizza Punks is so very much uh a comic about your experiences in Vancouver, I would say, more so than anything.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like at this point, it's just become it's like a time capsule for the Vancouver and music punk scene from like 2012 to 2017. You
Yeah.
know, like there's gig posters in the back that are actual gig posters for actual shows that my friends actually performed and co-headlined with. Or you know, sometimes I'll draw like real real people in it once in a while, or real clothing, or like a specific reference to some Vancouver musician or whatever. um so yeah, I definitely consider it more of like a artifact of like what Vancouver's punk scene was like between those like 5 years or whatever while I drew it, um
Yeah. Which
rather
is
than
really
it be
nice
like this
because
indigeneity story.
yeah, and I really treasure Pizza Punks is a comic I've bought so many times because like I meet someone and I just can't let them leave without it, basically.
Mhm.
But it's also really nice, like, I don't know how you felt going out to shows more often lately, but there's definitely like a shift in the music scene right now. Like a lot of bands kind of folded over the pandemic, and there's a lot of new, younger, fresh people who have not had the light drain out of their eyes. um, but yeah, when we went to Le Tigre last month,
Mhm.
uh, it was such a funny, it was such a lovely show to see the different generations of people that like I think we've been seeing around for years.
Totally.
Um, it felt like a weird punk reunion of sorts.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, La Tigra was really fun. For those who don't know, Wes and I are actually like best friends, and we go to shows together all the time, and we shit talk all of you who are watching behind your back.
Always,
Um,
that's our gossip.
yeah, that's the true gossip. Um, yeah, I know like Vancouver's really changed with the music scene just because, yeah, you're right, COVID and all that sort of stuff. But also like the venues, the
Mhm.
turnaround's so fast now at this point. Um, some places stay open and relocate, but a lot of them shut down. And sometimes they reopen with a different name a couple of years later. But even then, they feel a lot different than what they were like a couple of years ago. So, you know, oh, I don't want to like talk badly about them or anything, but I love Redgate. It's a venue in Vancouver and on Main Street, and it was like kind of like the cool DIY space a couple of years ago, and it still is. But it's now that the fact that it's on Main Street, there's all these like breweries around it,
Yeah.
and it's just a totally different crowd that shows up as soon as it hits like 10 p.m. on a Friday. All these like Granville Street bro type people start coming in, but like your friends are still performing and they're like making fun of them on stage while they're performing, or they're like shotgunning beers and making asses of themselves while your friends like pouring their heart out doing like singer songwriter stuff. So it's like the crowd on Main Street is such a different vibe than it was a couple years ago, and the venues that are there now, I feel like when I go to them, there's like this ripple effect of like, oh, do I want to go there anymore? Because this bro culture is gonna show up when it's 11 or something like that. Um, and I don't really know how to stop that besides hopefully they learn how to operate and behave in those sort of spaces, because I really don't want Redgate gone. I really love it, and I love the community that we have there. But
Mhm.
man, there was one show I went to this summer where it was just like full of weird bros who were just saying the weirdest comments and saying like edge lord stuff just for being a shithead, because they're drunk and they just want to like make their friend laugh. And I'm like, I would never imagine this type of person to show up at Redgate, but here we are now.
Yeah, especially
So
like so many of these venues, at least to me and in my experience, like have been really important for the queer community as well.
yes.
Um, like, yeah, it's Redgate was one of the first venues that I really, as a very introverted and very easily anxious person, could feel comfortable at, even alone. Um, but yeah, we have Q&A pretty quick, but I'm gonna slot one in that I stole from one of my coworkers. Because they are curious about what works and artists have been inspiring you lately.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, on the top of my mind right now, um, the first artist I would say is Dempsey Bob.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that is because he was the wolf elder who led my grandmother's funeral.
Mm.
And he came all the way up for my grandmother's funeral. And he taught me a ton of new protocol that I had never learned before because I grew up off reserve and I never grew up in my traditional territory. So I learned a lot of new information about how to act and behave as a Teltan wolf man, as a clan member of the wolf clan, and just as a Teltan person in general. And he's someone I've always looked up to because he's kind of been like one of the defining Teltan artists because he's
Mhm.
always had his work out there. People have always known him,
Well, his
and
work has
he's
always
just
evolved.
yeah, his work is really it's really good, and he's such an interesting person. And I went to Montreal for MCAF as a guest this year. And the first thing I did when I went to Montreal was go to his solo show, because he's been touring a big solo show for a while now. And it's gone to Vancouver, it's gone to a bunch of other places around the world. But right now, it's in Montreal. So I got to Montreal, hung out for the day, had poutine at night. And then the first thing I did, I woke up in the morning, I went to the art gallery to go see Dempsey Bob's show. And something I learned at my grandma's service, which I never knew, surprisingly, that my grandmother and Dempsey Bob were really good friends, like really, really good friends. And Dempsey, he had lots of speeches about my grandmother, about how strong of a woman she was, and how much effort she put into the Tahltan Nation, and how much effort she put into Dempsey's career. And there was a lot of things I learned that, like, I guess my grandma did for Dempsey that, like, really changed his perspective and helped him in his career. So I guess, like, an example of that is that my grandma got Dempsey Bob his first teaching job in Ross River in the 90s. And that propelled his career into becoming an instructor of carving. And then later in life, Dempsey applied to teach carving at the jail in Whitehorse. And he got to do that because my grandmother advocated for him to do it. And even though Dempsey Bob, it's carving, like, it's tools, it's sharp objects, you're not supposed to have them in jail. He was able to go and bring all his tools and teach all the inmates how to carve. And the reason why he did that is because he knew that there was Tahltan people in jail. He knew that there was Southern Shoshone people in jail. He knew that our people, our First Nations, are stuck in jail. And because of that, they're disconnected. And they're told that they're not human anymore because they're going through the system. And he wanted to make sure that those people could reconnect to their culture. And my grandmother fought to make that happen. So someone who's really inspired me right now is Dempsey Bob, and he always has. But right now, he's, really in my heart right now. So
Yeah, Dempsey's he's such an incredible speaker too. Like, he's so generous and gentle. I remember he came to Emily Carr and did a talk, and just the way he spoke, it wasn't particularly, dressed up or anything. But the earnestness with which he spoke, like, made me cry in this artist talk. And all he was saying is, like, I just want to keep doing this is because our art is so beautiful.
yeah.
And yeah. Aw.
It was, Dempsey did say he makes his art for us, and that's kind of what I try and do with my work, is that I'm trying to make it for us. I'm not trying to make it for non-Indigenous people. The fact that you can read it and you can understand it and appreciate it and you're engaged with it as a non-Indigenous person, I guess that just speaks to how accessible my work is. But I am making comics for my family. I'm making comics for my community. And if anyone else, follows along, that's just kind of like a plus. And yeah, I just want to make sure I have a culturally accurate and correct representation of Yukon First Nations and of Tahltan people. And hopefully, I don't trip up. And hopefully, if I do, you tell me what I did wrong and I can correct myself.
I don't have any questions dropped in the Q&A box, but if anyone would like to drop some in, now is the time. Now I want to go see this show by Dempsey.
It was in Vancouver.
I saw it. I just
Yeah,
like it that much.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really cool show. Oh, we got a question.
Yeah, we got Roy asking if Cole is working on any panels currently.
Um, well, the reality of this year has been so busy with promoting my book and with grief and all that other stuff that for a long time that this comic that I made for CMAG was the only comic I drew all year. And it was like fun, but it was only 6 pages. And I'm used to drawing like a page a day. So for a long time, I kind of felt defeated knowing that like I've made so little this year. But Wes and I are in a group show in Nanaimo,
Oh yeah.
and it's called Gutters Are Elastic. And we both made new work for that
Mhm.
show. And I would call it I'm working on my first Teltan graphic novel now, finally, because my books have all been Southern Shoshone, at least most of them. Quander, it does have some Teltan stories in them, but they're only like 1-page comics. But this book I'm working on now is exclusively about Teltan shapes. It's about cultural motifs that we use. It's about our culture, but it's wordless. There's no panels. Every page is going to be a 2-page spread. I am 16 pages in, and I have 84 more to go. And the book will be out next spring. So that's my next project, is this wordless Teltan shape transformation story. I don't really have a name for it yet. But yeah, I'm working on a new book. It's gonna be really different than my other work. But it's been really fun to draw because I'm not planning anything and I'm kind of just going off of what I made the last comic. And yeah, so I'm kind of like trying to give myself more creative freedom and less like structure of like things need to get done this way. Um, and I really like making comics that are like big research projects and are like big projects that you need to make right, because it's like it feels really rewarding when you get it done and everything's perfect. Um, but I'm ready to just kind of like have fun, just to play, and to make something that's less serious. So that's my next book, is something kind of more free form and yeah, not as like I need to get this angle right and perfect and this isn't done the way it's supposed to be represented. And I'm not really worried about that. I'm kind of just like creating this narrative that's loose and full of stuff that I'm comfortable with, juggling and playing around with.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited to see that because I'm I'm going the opposite direction. I'm like starting a more structured comic, and yeah, it's a challenge to like I didn't go to writing classes. I don't know a lot of a lot of story structure stuff other than like what I've learned through reading and watching other things. Um yeah, do you often start with a story first, or do you sometimes start with a character first? It was kind of a thought I had.
Well, for this book, it's definitely more like I'm coming up with a concept and then just sticking to like that barrier
Yeah.
of like I'm not planning the next page. I'm just drawing the next page, and I want each page to transform into something else. So
Mhm.
like the limits I gave myself for my new book are like really broad and really different. Um, but with um But with my other books, yeah, it's like you got to make sure this is right, and I'm messaging family members for references if they have any, and I'm trying to, get everything right before I draw it. And even then when I draw it, it's like, am I coloring it right? Is it a good representation and all those things? And yeah, it's just nice to do something totally different. Nice
Yeah.
break.
Yeah, one of you know Hugh, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Someone I've been really inspired by, and especially for shorter form comic projects where I don't need as much structure. I've been trying to like embrace more of Hugh's kind of sprawling texts and like abstract forms, and that's been so satisfying. We know so many cool artists, Cole.
We do. We're spoiled.
We're really spoiled.
Spoiled living in East Van, as long as we don't get priced out.
Yeah, let's not think about that right now. That's a later problem. But yeah, I think Joey's going to jump in pretty quick to conclude the event. Yeah, I'll hand it over. I'll hand it over
Hello.
to Pat.
Thank you both so much. Like it feels like a pleasure to listen to you both unfurl these stories, and for you, Cole, to share these stories about your family coming out of the comic, but being really embedded and then being like, this is my uncle who's sassy and I know he can take it. I just feel really grateful to be able to sit here and listen to you speak about that. And a lot of things struck Cole is like the way you both talked about these performative pressures of, and I say performative because it's like external pressures of other systems being like, oh, you're an Indigenous person, you talk about these stories, or you're an XYZ, but what does it mean to tell stories from within your community? Like it just really comes through how embedded you both are in that. Even when you talk about the punk scene in Vancouver, like it's really engaging to hear about. So I want to thank you both for that. And thank you everyone in the audience for joining us tonight. Yeah, it's getting dark over here in Toronto. Yeah, just to conclude, I hope everyone has a lovely night. Thank you for your time tonight. As a closing note, I think, with the current issue of gossip, which is going to be transitioned over soon, but it's like gossip is supposed to be murky, and that comes out in your text, Wes, too. Like there's good and bad. There's whose stories can you tell, as you also talked about. And I think the word gossip, because it incites a lot of emotion in people, usually encompasses all of that, and what stories are true, and the sources that they're coming from, that it encourages to ask. So yeah, thank you for your engagement with all of that. And I'll end off tonight by saying goodbye to everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for listening and watching.
Yeah, and thanks to CMAG for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cole.
Yeah.
Of course.